Amen. You can be seated. Thank you, Monica. I asked Monica to do that last minute because Len is away on vacation, and she dutifully looked at me and said, no. And my response was, submit, woman. I'm kidding. I didn't say that. It was implied. Open up your Bibles to Galatians chapter 4. That's our passage this morning. Galatians 4, it was just read. About a year or so ago, we took a family vacation, and our family vacations are interesting because Monica and Kennedy like to go on urban sightseeing type vacations. They like to see stuff. You know, they took a trip to Europe a little while ago, and they said how exciting it was to see the Eiffel Tower. I, on the other hand, if I want to see the Eiffel Tower, I just Google image it. I'm like, there it is, not a big deal. Vacations for Matthew and I are about adventure. You know, skiing, surfing, doing whatever. So anyway, last year, we did a compromise vacation. We, as a family, went down to Boston. We did some urban stuff in the city, fantastic city. We had a great time. But then we also loaded up into our rental car and drove like half an hour north or an hour north to New Hampshire. Do you know what the state slogan is for New Hampshire? Live free or die. Way to go. Yeah, that's right. Live free or die. I'm telling you, as soon as I crossed the border from Massachusetts into New Hampshire, all of my libertarian leanings just like came alive. I'm like, this is fantastic. I found home. Live free or die. Freedom is a value that we all hold so dearly. You know, culturally, it's held out as something that's so important, but also individually and personally, and we pursue it in all kinds of different ways. We are constantly trying to pursue our own freedom, sometimes subconsciously and unintentionally, but you know, some of the most important factors that shape your life are the ones that are subconscious and unspoken. The ones that you do not actually consciously become aware of and intentionally shape. Those are some of the most powerful voices that shape your existence. And so one of the important things about our lives as Christians is to take those subconscious, unspoken factors that influence our lives, identify them, name them, and then displace them with the story of the gospel. That's one of the purposes of Bible studies and sermons, is to become aware of those deep factors that influence and shape us, unspoken, subconscious, name them, and then intentionally displace them with the truth of the gospel. So we pursue freedom, but sometimes we pursue freedom in ways that actually leads to slavery. We are subconsciously pursuing freedom, but actually finding it enslaving. I'll give you a couple examples. The first one is this narrative of financial freedom. Well, certainly in one sense, financial freedom is a real thing. If you have money, you are free to do things. But in another sense, if you put all of your eggs in that basket, and financial freedom is the most important thing to you, you eventually become a slave to the paycheck. You work so hard saving all of your money and building your financial portfolio, not knowing that at age 56 you might die and never get to spend a penny of it. It promises freedom, but it's actually slavery. In the words of Jesus, if you pursue financial freedom as your God, you are actually storing up treasures where rust destroys, moths devour, and thieves can steal. It's a form of freedom that actually leads to slavery, if you know what I mean. Another example would be the freedom of personal autonomy. If you are, or if you remember back to when you were a late teen and you were beginning to plan to move out of your parents' home, you thought, man, this is going to be the moment of great freedom in my life, right? All those restricting curfews and my parents telling me to make my bed, I'm going to be so free. So you move out on your own and you find that now you're enslaved by rent. You're enslaved by craft dinner, you know? It's a false narrative of freedom that actually leads to slavery. I'll give you another example. Culturally, we're told that freedom lies in self-indulgence. Whatever bent you have, whatever thing it is that you want to pursue, that is what's going to lead you to freedom if you just go for it. But the problem is that that's an enslavement of another form. You become enslaved to this relentless taskmaster of yourself. Because you wake up every morning wondering, who am I supposed to be, and how can I then pursue freedom in that? What you find is that the freedom to choose is actually a slavery in itself. I'll give you a small example. I could list to you 10 million things that I love about Monica. There's a small, short list of things that bother me a lot. One of them is when we go out for dinner. And Monica, gets her menu, and we'll be out with the kids or something for dinner, and I open up the menu, and I'm just like, it's easy. I either want nachos or a burger. It's not hard. Make my choice in 2 seconds. The waiter is over there, and Monica has her menu open, and she's got too many choices, and she's like, well, maybe I'd like to have, that's my best Monica impersonation. Maybe I'd like to have, well, what? And then this is what she always does. She goes, well, what do you recommend? The waiter will say, oh, I recommend this. And she'll say, okay, well, I'll have that. And inevitably, she gets it and then doesn't like it and says, I wish I had just ordered something on my own. You see, too many choices bring with them a slavery of themselves. So this idea of self-indulgence, if you pursue it for your own freedom and you put all of your eggs in that basket, it's a false narrative that actually leads to slavery. Well, there's nothing worse than the loss of freedom. In fact, we as a culture hold that out as the single worst thing. If we have people in our society who commit the most heinous acts, what do? We take their freedom away from them. We put them in prisons. We lock them up. But the truth of the matter is, most of us live our lives enslaved in some way or another. And so today's passage is all about that. It's all about freedom and slavery. And the passage is going to show us very clearly that there's only one way to true freedom. Freedom that actually brings the release from shackles and slavery. And you probably guessed it, it's the gospel. This passage is going to show that there are actually two distinct ways to relate to God, that are actually two distinct ways of living your life and seeing your life and making your decisions. The one way is, can I use fancy words for a minute? And I promise I'll unpack them. The one way is egocentric or ethnocentric, and the other one is theocentric. Let me tell you what I mean. There are two ways of viewing your relationship with God and two different ways of viewing your life. One way leads to freedom, one way leads to slavery. The first way of viewing your life and viewing your relationship with God puts you at the center of your life. The second way puts God at the center of everything. And a way of living and relating to God that puts you at the center is not freedom at all, but actually slavery. And the way of living and viewing your relationship with God that puts him at the center is actually true freedom. Let's unpack it. Open up Galatians chapter 4, verse 21 to 30. Paul is actually referring to an Old Testament account that we covered, I guess, a few months ago when we were preaching through the first few chapters of Genesis. And that is the account of Abraham. And he uses this to demonstrate his point. Abraham had two significant women in his lives, both of whom had sons. The first is a picture of people putting themselves at the center of their own lives and at the center of their relationship with God. So the first picture is that of Hagar and Ishmael. You guys know the story. God promised Abraham that he would have a son. But Abraham and Sarah reached the point where they said, well, clearly God isn't delivering on his promises, so we need to take matters into our own hands. We need to do something about this to help God out. You see, that's putting yourself at the center of your relationship with God and putting yourself at the center of your life. Hagar and Ishmael is the picture of rules, reward, and punishment system. Look at verse 21. That's what Paul has in mind when he says, you're living under the law. You desire to live under the law. The law puts you at the center and says what really, really matters is what you do and don't do. If you're at the center, then your relationship with God is about you reaching out for him, you trying to help him out. Either help God out with the timing. Perhaps God has promised something to you and it's taking longer than you think it should. You say, well, maybe if I just do something, if I throw in a little bit of my own effort, I can help God out. He clearly has the timing wrong. Or maybe it's helping God out with the final result, taking control of it. Well, Paul tells you that that is actually a way of living that leads to slavery. It's slavery because it's a system that begins with me, And the moment that I begin my life and my relationship with God from myself, I fall into two traps: the trap of self-identification and the trap of self-construction. If I look at my life and my relationship with God and I say, well, the single most important thing is about me and how I reach out to God, what ends up happening is I ask myself the question, who am I? But I've created an internal logical loop because the only thing I'm doing is looking at me. And so I turn in on myself. And it's enslaving because you're only ever defined by who you are in that moment and how you feel and what are your emotions and the things that are said against you at that moment. Same with self-construction. If you look at your life and say, well, it begins with me, then you say, well, who am I becoming? And all you can see is nothing beyond the end of your own nose. All you can see is what you see in the mirror. It's like a feedback loop in audio systems, you know? When the microphone picks up its own amplified sound and it turns back, and what does it sound like? Everybody plugs their ears. To begin your idea and your understanding of your relationship with God and your life with yourself will only feed back again on yourself and lead you to a place of despair and slavery. There's no good news, there's no freedom in that. You end up living in the prison of your own hell because you can't get out beyond yourself. And you know, when you're in prison, you need someone on the outside to unlock you and release you. You can't let yourself out. All of your own best efforts amount to nothing more than just banging and clanging against the bars. Well, Paul says that's the first picture, the picture of Hagar and Ishmael, the picture of trying to do it on your own, trying to find freedom on your own that actually only just leads to slavery. He gives another picture of this, humans reaching for God, human effort, human trying. Look at verse 25. He says, the present Jerusalem. He says another example of this is the present city of Jerusalem. Well, here's the backstory on that. God promised his people a place, a city where there would be perfect peace and shalom, wholeness, fulfillment. But Paul says, if you look at the earthly city of Jerusalem, you see exhibit A of why that goes wrong. God promises a place for them, for God's people, but then God's people try to make it and fashion it themselves. And anytime human beings put their own effort into something, they mess it all up. Look at the mess that is the current city of Jerusalem. Strife and anger, warfare, it's terrible. Paul says, anytime that human beings try to rely on their own effort, put themselves at the center of the equation, whether it's in their relationship with God or their life, they mess it all up. Look at Hagar and Ishmael. Look at the current city of Jerusalem. Any effort on our own part promises freedom but results in slavery. And so, pause for a moment and think, what are the areas in your life where you are relying on your own best efforts to fix something, to force something, to try to help God out a little bit? Well, those are precisely the places where you need to realize those are illusions of freedom. Those are actually relentless taskmasters. And when you come right up against it, you are stripped and divested of any sense that you could ever find freedom on your own. That your own best efforts to control things actually just mess them up. The good news is that that's not supposed to lead you to despair. When you discover that, it doesn't lead you to despair. What it actually does is strips you of the illusions of control and of freedom that are out there and leads you to a place of trusting in God. Removing yourself from the center of the universe in your relationship with him and putting him back rightly at the middle of everything. That's when you find freedom. And so Paul's going to give us, again, two pictures of that. The first one is that of Sarah and Isaac. You know the story of Sarah and Isaac. Sarah was barren. She was well beyond childbearing years, if you read the account in Genesis. Not to mention the fact that Abraham was really old, and this was before there were little blue pills. So Sarah and Isaac are the picture, Paul says, not of human beings trying to make something happen on their own effort, that's slavery, but of human beings resting and trusting in the promises of God. That's the pathway to true freedom. Paul says true freedom is found not in trying to make something happen or helping God out, but actually resting in the fact that he's the miracle-working God. You see, the image of Sarah's barrenness is that she can do nothing to make the miracle happen on her own. She needs a solution from the outside. And that's the picture for you and me too. When it comes to our relationship with God, when it comes to our lives, we always come up against the point where we realize we can't just grab ourselves by the bootstraps and pull ourselves up. We need an external solution. But when you look to Sarah and Isaac as a picture of that, you see that barren Sarah gets Isaac because it's a free gift, a miraculous mercy from God, and that you and I get grace the exact same way. Not because we merit it, not because we deserve it, not because we try hard to get it, but because we trust in the God who gives freely. Well, friends, that's how to find freedom in relationship with God. To come up against the fact that your own efforts only enslave you. And then to trust in the fact that he's the God who gives grace freely to those who do not deserve it. That's good news. Paul gives one more picture of this true picture of freedom. He says if the present city of Jerusalem is the picture of slavery and human effort, he says the picture of the new Jerusalem, the Jerusalem that is from above, is the picture of true freedom. Well, think about that picture. Do you know the story in Revelation 21 where St. John says, "And I saw the new Jerusalem coming down from heaven"? Here's the point. The promised city of God, the place of peace and rest, is not a city of human effort and human construction. It comes down from heaven. It's a gift from God. It's his work. It's his gift to a people who don't deserve it, to you and to me. Anytime there's human effort involved, it's slavery. Anytime we rest in and trust in the promises of God, it's freedom. When we come to that place of realizing that and reminding ourselves of it, you understand that in your relationship with God and in your life in his world, there's no sweat. You know, it's a life that has an unfurrowed brow. I used to go to the gym. I haven't in a long time, as you can probably tell. And when I was there, I would see these guys who were like, I don't know, really muscly. I enviously called them meatheads. But anyway, the meatheads would always be at the squat rack, and they'd have the bar with like 10,000 pounds on it or something bending across their back, and they would like be under, and they, right? The furrowed brow. Well, if that's the picture of your life, you haven't got the gospel yet. You still have yourself and your effort at the center of everything. The picture of a gospel-shaped life, a picture of true freedom, is just a picture of resting and trusting in the promises of God. You see, your life and the way you relate to God is not ultimately about your effort or your work. It's not even about you finding ways to help God out. That's the gospel. That it's all his work. He does it. I want you just for a moment to imagine if that's true, how it would change everything in your life, right? If it's true that you and your efforts are not at the center of your family, your relationships, your job, your current joys, your current struggles, but God is in the center of those things, how would that change things? Right? You would stop grunting and trying, and you'd start trusting. And you'd find that you were rescued from the prison of your own hell. You were set free to be like a little child who trusts completely in his parents. Ultimately, you'd find that you are set free not only from your efforts, but you're now free to be wrong. You ever thought about that? if your life and your relationship with God is all about you and your own efforts, then you can't take a wrong step. Otherwise, the consequences and the stakes are too high. But if your life and your relationship isn't about you and your efforts, but about God and what he does for you, then you're set free to even be wrong. You're no longer enslaved by trying to keep up outer appearances. You can step off that treadmill. See, the real slavery, the deepest slavery, is slavery to yourself. You know, when you think that your life is all about your own ability to rescue you from yourself at your worst. Well, that just leads to despair. That's slavery, no matter how hard you try. Or slavery at the opposite end of yourself, when you are enslaved by you at your best. You know, you have a reputation to keep up, and you want to make sure that people think that you're so good and got it so together. That's an equal form of slavery at the opposite end of the spectrum. The worst kind of slavery is a slavery to the self. But here's what Martin Luther said. It's a pretty long quote, but I want to read it all to you. He said, God accepts only the forsaken, cures only the sick, gives sight only to the blind, restores life only to the dead, sanctifies only the sinners, gives wisdom only to the unwise fools. In short, he has mercy only on those who are wretched, and gives grace only to those who are not in grace. Therefore, no proud saint, no wise or just person can become God's material. St. Paul in Galatians 4 says, there are two different ways of viewing your relationship with God, two different ways of viewing your life. One will lead to slavery. The other one leads to freedom. Now, here's the really good news. It's not about you choosing one or the other. Because choosing is actually a slavery on its own. Remember Monica with her menu? To find true freedom is not about you choosing one path or the other. It's about you simply looking to the cross. And on the cross, seeing that God is the one who takes all of the initiative to rescue you, save you, and deal with the biggest issues in your life. It's about you looking to the cross and simply resting in what God has done for you. To put it in language of this passage, look at verse 31. Paul says, you are no longer a child of the slave, you are a child of the free. It's the picture of birth. And what Paul wants you to know is, you're not even enslaved to having to make the choice between one or the other. God has already made the choice for you. You are a child of the free. And you have about as much to do with your rebirth as you had to do with your birth. It's not about you. You're not at the center. You don't even have to choose. You are already a child of the free. Your only response is not to try, not to even choose, but verse 27, to rejoice. Just simply rejoice. And watch the good news of God's initiative in the gospel lift off all of the yoke of slavery and set you free. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, when it comes to our lives, our relationships, and even our relationship with you, we so easily fall into the trap of putting ourselves and our own efforts at the center, just trying harder. Lord, I pray that this truth that we are children of the free, that you are the God who has done it all for us in Jesus on the cross. I pray that that would give us true freedom and set us free to rejoice in you. And so we pray together.